Hello, and welcome to Futuring Is, a sparkling new podcast where we're going to discover the thinkers, dreamers, and doers who are reshaping our world for the better by using the future as a lens. My name is Suzanne Whitby, and I am a futurer and futures researcher, a facilitator, communicator, and storyteller. Everything I do focuses on how we can co-create what I call hopeful, sustainable futures. These futures aren't dystopias or utopias, but they are futures where we're headed in the right direction. Futures plural because there are many possible futures that exist, limited possibly only by imagination, something that we'll discuss today. And futures plural because we're all different. I don't believe that there is a single future that will inspire all of us living today to be the first multi-generational group to shift en masse towards more sustainable ways of living and being. Different versions of hopeful, sustainable futures, the stories that we tell ourselves of how we and the world can be, will vary from place to place and person to person. Now that I have given you a quick introduction to the podcast, it is my absolute privilege to be able to introduce you to today's guest. It is a privilege because of the work he has done and continues to do, and a privilege because I came across him and his writing in 2010, and he and it inspired me to lean into my conviction that stories were a way to tackle some, or all, of the world's wicked problems. His name is Rob Hopkins, and he is the co-founder of Transition Network and of Transition Town Totnes. He's an author of several books, including The Transition Handbook, The Power of Just Doing Stuff, and most recently, From What Is to What If, Unleashing the Power of Imagination to Create the Future We Want. In his podcast, From What If to What Next, he spoke to hundreds of people over 100 episodes. He's an Ashoka Fellow, he's spoken at TED Global and TEDx events, he appears in the French film phenomenon Daman, and holds a PhD from the University of Plymouth, as well as 2 honoris causa, and he has a new book and a collaborative music project coming out later this year, which I'll leave him to tell you about himself. Rob, welcome. I'm so pleased to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you. What an honor to be here.
Fantastic. So, I know, and the people who are listening may not know this, I know that you have a time machine. In fact, I've definitely seen a photo of you on your travels holding up a sign that says, "I've been to the future and we won." So to kick us off, I'd love you to tell us where and when in the future you've been recently, and what you saw, heard, smelled, touched, and tasted there that convinced you that in the future we'd won.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Suzanne. I live in a small town in South Devon called Totnes, and people know a lot of things about Totnes, but what they probably don't know is that we are really like the Cape Canaveral of time travel down here. And we've been working on this for some time. And, you know, the temptation when you have a time machine is, of course, to do all the sorts of things like go back and see the dinosaurs, go back and meet Cleopatra, go and watch the Velvet Underground playing at the Boston Tea Party in 1968. But actually what we use our time machine for is to travel forward, and not actually to travel forward very far, because one of the things that really motivated us was the Paris Climate Agreement that was signed in 2015 in Paris, as you might imagine, set out the pathway for which the world was going to get to zero carbon by 2050. And in that, for that to work, we have to pass through a 2030 in which we've reduced our carbon emissions by 48%. So I'm not really interested in distant utopias, in even that 2050 particularly, because if we don't go through the eye of that needle of 2030, we've got no chance. We're going to miss everything else. So for me, I'm most fascinated in that 2030. And it's important to say that when we calibrate our time machine and get the disbelief suspenders working properly, that when we look forward, there are many different quantum threads that stretch from the present out into the future. There are many different futures. The future is not fixed. The future is not set. And there are many of those futures that we've traveled to, believe me, and they're horrible. And we really don't want to go there. I think your listeners can hopefully trust me on that. But there are some of those threads that take us to the futures that result from us doing absolutely everything we could possibly have done. And that's the 2030 that we travel to. Because for me, the way that we get there in that future is by cultivating longing in the present for that future. So I travel there with my colleague, Mr. Kit. We travel and while we're there, we collect photographs of the place. We bring back artifacts. We make sound recordings and take video of what that world looks like and feels like and sounds like. And then we bring them back to people here in the present day to use that as the thing that triggers their longing for that world. The kind of subtle details, the smells, the tastes. The poet Rilke used to say the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And for me, that's kind of the power of our time machine. So the 2030 that we travel to, I guess some of the things that really stand out when we get there is, firstly, every time we step out of the time machine into the streets of that world, is in many ways it looks very similar. It's not that far off, right? It's not like the whole place has been rebuilt like some sort of Buck Rogers kind of fantasy. But actually, the three things initially that you notice is, firstly, how different the air smells in urban spaces. Like it smells like, you can sort of smell like you almost have to have a nose like a sommelier, to be able to smell the different, more subtle things, like the herbs you can smell now growing in the city, the blossom from the fruit trees, how much cleaner the air is, and how much that means you can smell. It's like spring in the mountains now in cities. The second thing is how much louder the bird song is. The banning of pesticides that happened in 2026 led to a whole lot of other policies that were made in urban spaces to invite the biodiversity back, and changes in food and farming practices meant that there were birds that I could hear in cities that I couldn't recognize now. And it was so much louder. It was like somebody had turned up the volume on the bird song. In that sense, it was absolutely beautiful. And now different parts of the city kind of try to attract different birds. So there are parts of the city now where revelers, after they've been out clubbing at night, end up going to this particular part of the city where they can hear the nightingales singing. And it's become like a sort of a part of local culture, as bird song gets woven back into our everyday life and culture. And the last thing I think is that always strikes me every time we start walking around in that world is the look on people's when you engage people look you in the eyes more. It feels like sort of like the unclenching of a fist. Do you know, there's a look in people's eyes, a sense of, I think we might just do this. There's like a sense of collective shared purpose and excitement, and they can see that young people's mental health is improving. They can see the natural world around them becoming more diverse. They can see the sort of precariousness that so many people felt back in 2025, that was entirely the result of particular political decisions, is now going into reverse. And people feel held and supported and part of something. And you can see that in people's eyes and how they look at you and how they look at each other. I think those are the three. I mean, I could talk about it for hours and hours. I often do. And on the podcast, we would always get people to describe to us how that looked like. But certainly for me, those are my three main first impressions when we travel there.
That's a wonderful vision of a possible future. Thank you for taking us on that journey and for explaining why you invite people to explore 2030. It makes a lot of sense. What I understand from this is that you're not trying to transport people into a distant future, so 70 plus years, as we might do in a futures literacy exercise, for example, to really stretch people's imaginations. And the short time frame is probably very helpful for people because it's much more tangible. However, 5 years to achieve the kind of change that you're talking about seems very short. What I'm curious about is, what do you do when it's 2029, for example, and you're inviting people to think about a possible future that is only a year away, particularly if we haven't moved the bar much in terms of climate action? In this sort of situation, you might be asking people to imagine a future that may be completely impossible given systemic and other factors. I'm curious about how you'd inspire people then. I'm also curious about the value of such a short time frame in this sort of situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, because I'm just about to publish a new book on how to fall in love with the future, and and that's all written around 2030. So I had this discussion with the publisher where the publisher said, look, actually this book, we want this book to be as relevant in
Mm.
5 years time as it is now. Couldn't you just make it 2040?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, no, because the point of this is that we're not here to negotiate with physics.
Mm.
We are already way past a lot of the we are way past the moment where it's like, can we stop climate change?
Yeah.
Climate change is happening. Climate change is accelerating faster than many of the predictions anticipated. Like, for me, getting to that stage by 2030 is non-negotiable. And actually, of course, it's much easier. And I have the same when I go and do work for organizations. They're like, 2030, it's not very far away. I'm like, yeah, that's the point.
Okay, all right.
The point. It's not very far away. So what are we going to do about it?
Okay.
We can't just keep backsliding on the targets all the time. And, the thing that I learned from the first book that I wrote about imagination, which you mentioned, From What Is to What If, is that the imagination loves limits. So when you put limits on the imagination, and I've seen it again and again in workshops run by myself and by other people as well, like in donut economics workshops, when you define what you can't do, we can't go that way because that's the planetary boundaries. We can't go that way because that's the social foundation that we need to ensure for everyone. So you need to innovate within this sweet spot. People are so much more innovative than people like Donald Trump are, who imagine there are no limits to anything. So for me, it's like I keep that as the target because that's the target. Yeah. It's 2030 and nothing's happened, then we'll have to start again from scratch. While there's any chance of us doing it, we have to keep fighting for that, I think.
Right, so let me make sure that I understand. Just reflecting on what you've said and thinking about continuing to travel to possible futures in 2030, what I'm hearing from you is that it's critical to focus on 2030, and that even if we only have small wins, or even if we can only make limited progress between, say, 2029 and 2030, it's still worth focusing on this date. Because the wins, or maybe the better word here is successes, that we celebrate are not the destination. They're milestones on a longer journey. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I and others try to do is to move us away from this idea that climate change is something that we either win or we lose. It's not quite like that. It's much more like every single fraction of a degree that the world warms has very real implications in terms of the number of lives lost, the number of the decline of crops, the decline of biodiversity, etc., etc. So it's about slowing this increase, which is something that we've spectacularly failed to do so. First, part of the motivation for the new book really actually came from, with the podcast that I was doing, shifting when I started that podcast, I set myself a rule to say that I would never do any episodes with two white male guests. And it pushed me to really find voices from far outside my usual sort of comfort bubble of people like me normally tend to invite onto each other's podcasts, And so for me, it opened up a whole sort of world of like, move me beyond this bubble of basically middle-aged white guys writing books about collapse into voices of mostly women of color, mostly in the US now, who are writing extraordinary stuff about imagination and time travel and the radical imagination. And it's like, well, okay, so what does it look like if we look at the climate movement through that lens rather than another book about extinction and collapse? And that's really part of that move away from saying it's all or nothing.
So that brings me to another question. When we spoke briefly last week, you spoke about this new lens that you've been applying to the work that you're doing, which you've just been discussing, and you explicitly mentioned the importance of temporal fluidity. So I'm curious, what does this mean to you? What have you learned from your research and your reading? And to what extent do you think that we humans might need to get more comfortable with this idea? That we need to be better at being more temporally fluid?
So what I mean by temporal fluidity is a willingness to to be more flexible with time. I think there's often something I've noticed for many years in activist culture. We face a threat in the present, whether it's be it Gaza or climate change or the erosion of civil liberties or whatever, and we go into kind of fight or flight sort of protest mode. What do we want? When do we want it? Now. Everything's very much in the present, you know. And actually, what I learned from reading the work of incredible people in the US, like Black Quantum Futurism, artists like Camille Turner, is this thing of, well, actually, maybe there's a space to saying, what do we want? When do we want it? In about 250 years, or about 37 years ago, or, you know, it's like, if we can become more fluid and with time is somebody once defined time as nature's way of stopping everything from happening at once, which I really, really love. And there is what those activists are talking about is that we need to be able to help people travel to the future, travel to the past, experience both of those things, use the future to help understand the past, use the past to help us understand the future, be able to experience those states in a really, you know, books like Kindred by Octavia Butler, a book about being picked up out of the future, taken back into the past, you know, has really inspired a whole sort of generation of young Black activists in America writing speculative fiction because they grew up with loving science fiction, but all the science fiction visions of the future didn't have any people of color in those stories. So Afrofuturism is this incredibly vibrant movement about telling stories about a future in which Black people are flourishing, and it's so powerful and beautiful, I think. So, but I've completely forgotten what your question was. Sorry, I've gone off on one.
I think you've already answered, to be honest. I was just asking about whether you think we need to be more comfortable with being temporally fluid.
Yes. Yeah. So what I try and do in the work that I do now is to give people multisensory experiences at the end of which they can say, when I was in the future or when I was in the past. Because, you know, as Bell Hooks said, what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. And I love this. You know, you mentioned that when I've been to the future we won, which is a T-shirt I saw a young woman wearing at a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington in 2020, and it kind of gave me goosebumps when I saw it, and it shifted the way that I work completely. So rather than saying what we need to do is this, I say I've just come back from 2030 and it's all happening. Oh my God, it's amazing! And what I see in workshops and in talks is it touches people in a very, very different way. Like I see people. Like it really emotionally touches people. This idea, there's a woman who I write about in the book who was inspired by seeing that photograph of me with my time travel suit on and my I've been to the future we want sign. And in a town in France, she did the same thing. She wanted to start a transition group in her town, so she bought herself a cheap time traveler's costume on eBay, I think, and had a sign written with that in French, "Je viens du futur," something, whatever the rest of it is. And she rode through her town on a horse, a bit like Joan of Arc, and with giving out leaflets to come to the first meeting of forming a transition town. And she made a film, French TV, called Return to Plabanec, which is the name of the town where she was doing it. Beautiful. And last year, when they had the French elections and the far right very, very nearly won, they won the first round of the voting. And for the first time since the 1930s, the left organized under a single banner, the Front Populaire. She went to this demonstration in Nantes, and there was a photograph of her standing at the front of this march in her time traveler's costume with her "I've been to the future we won" sign. That photo got in every French newspaper. It went mad on social media. It got on French TV. It was wild. And I said to her, why did she think that was? And she said, because I think in times when things feel really uncertain and frightening, to have somebody kind of step back through the fabric of time to you and say, it's all right, don't worry, it's gonna turn out okay, is a hugely powerful thing, actually, a really important thing to be doing. So I guess that's kind of what I try to do in as multi-sensory a way as I can.
And this is so interesting. A lot of the work that I do involves multisensory work, specifically the combination of multisensory experiences and stories of the future, all grounded in place. In my research, I found quite a lot of academic literature that explores this idea of pre-experiencing the future through the senses. So traveling to the future via your imagination, or in your case, using your portable time machine, and seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling in that future, this is really powerful. And of course, when we use our senses, there's an emotional response, and emotional responses make experiences sticky, more memorable, more likely to transport us in the future. Probably the most famous example of this, and I'm sure you know this, Rob, is that of Marcel Proust, where one of his characters eats a Madeleine, I don't know how you pronounce it correctly in French, soaked with tea, and then this causes him to recall a long-forgotten childhood memory of eating a tea-soaked biscuit or a tea-soaked Madeleine with his aunt, and this prompts more memories of his childhood, and he is transported back into this place. So you talking about experiencing the sensory aspects of possible futures and describing trips to the future using sensory language is so powerful. It means that there are lots of things that could help to transport us back into the future we want. You mentioned birdsong at the start of our conversation, for example. Just moving on from sensory experiences to the stories themselves, I'm curious, do you think that it is more powerful for people to uncover and tell their own stories of possible futures, or is it more powerful for you to tell them yours?
I usually do both,
Mm-hmm.
but I always do it in such a way that I get them to imagine theirs first,
Okay.
so that I'm not leading them.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that for me is most fascinating about this. So the exercise I do where I bring along my time machine, which is the smaller portable version of a time machine that our team have developed here, because the original one that was built on the chassis of an old school bus, after Brexit, it was very difficult to get an export license for a time machine, really pain in the ass. So this new one allows you to basically turn any other space into a time machine. It's some pretty serious quantum shit. It would take me a long time to explain, but it's very good anyway. So we so when I do that exercise, I've done that exercise now with thousands and thousands of people, with 1,500 people in a hall in Brussels, 10 people in a workshop, and everywhere in between. And what's fascinating about it for me is how universal the experiences that people report back afterwards are. No one ever says, "Oh, in 2030 we've got a new IKEA that's 4 times bigger than the one we used to have." Everybody says, "Oh, the bird song is louder, the air smells cleaner, people look much more relaxed, people are doing more meaningful work." It's the same. And I recently read a paper written in 1990 by Elise Boulding, who was a professor of peace studies, who did a very, very, very similar activity in men's and women's prisons in the United States in 1990, and wrote a really fascinating paper about her experiences of doing that. And people were reporting exactly the same. And she said something like, "It all makes me feel like we have many more co-workers in this task than we might have imagined." It's like, where are the political platforms that start there and work backwards? And I think one of the reasons it works is that we live in an economy that's all about dopamine and pleasure and selling us short-term hits of pleasure. Whereas what that exercise is, it's about happiness and contentment, and it somehow gets around the pleasure and the dopamine and into, well, what would a future that I would really long for be like? And her speculation was that if you went back to any point in human history, you would hear largely the same.
Same thing.
Like
Yeah,
I said,
it's really interesting.
and that for me, it's like you mentioned about it's what I call memories of the future. It's this idea that because the part of our brain, when we imagine the future or remember the past, it's exactly the same neural pathways, the same process. So when we help people to imagine the future that turned out as best it possibly could in a way that's multisensory and includes smell and touch and taste and audio recordings and visual stuff, and they do it with other people, and it's fun, and they laugh and they connect to people and they attach emotions to those memories, then it means the next time they go to try and imagine a low carbon future. They go to their memory. They have this beautiful, sparkly thing that they loved, that really magical day that they experienced where they imagined the future with those other people. And that was the future they really wanted to see. And so that creation of memories of the future is one of the things that's most powerful and important about doing this, I think.
Thank you, thank you. So one of the things I've noticed in your work, when you get people to imagine possible futures, you encourage them to imagine futures that aren't biased. They're not completely dystopian or utopian. I think this is really interesting because this not only helps people build a vision for what's possible, something that they can work towards, but it also helps them build resilience. In one of your podcasts, I forget which number, you spoke to two women about veganism, and one of the guests explicitly said something like, it's not been easy getting here and not all the problems are solved. That those are the words that she was sort of using to describe the future that she was envisioning. And for me, this ability to help people envision both the successes and the struggles might also be interesting in your work. I'm not sure if you've heard of Jane McGonigal. She's a futurist with a gaming background. And about 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer, she created a future visioning game with thousands of people. They all took part in this game, and part of the work involved was to envision a pandemic-style world and pre-experience it. And then, of course, 10 years later, more or less, COVID came along. And it turns out that many of the people who had pre-experienced this future through the game felt more able to cope and also less anxious about the situation. So I guess I'm wondering, when you prime people to imagine a future in which we've done everything we can to address climate change and various sustainability challenges, and making sure that that isn't a dystopia or a utopia, are you thinking about this resiliency aspect at all?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's what some people call rehearsing the future. It's but I guess for me, I feel like the world has quite enough dystopian stories already. Thank you very much. I don't think we need any more. Every other film is like some dystopian human beings being wiped out by gremlins or asteroids or viruses or monsters or robots or etc. 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 Very, very few films about us actually getting our shit together and sorting something out. So there's a beautiful activity that I had the honor to co-facilitate last year with Ruth Bentovim, who's a friend of mine, who developed this extraordinary thing called Town Anywhere, which we first did in 2013. It was developed for one of the early Transition Town conferences. And you need a big space, you need between 100 and 300 people. And you start by imagining that you're traveling forward 10 years into the future. And then you go through this series of stages where you meet other people and and there's different areas of, you start thinking, well, what am I doing in that future? What's my role? What have I created? What's my work? What am I doing here? And then you meet other people who are interested in that as well. And then together you build that world literally, physically, with cardboard boxes and bamboo canes and sticky tape and string and pens. And then you spend 3 hours in it, trading in it, celebrating in it, inhabiting in it, meeting other people, telling each other stories. It's one of the most magical, extraordinary, beautiful things I've ever been part of. It moves people to tears. It's just, and there's a thing of that. The first time that I did that, I ended up with a group of people where we created something called the Yeast Collective, which was a brewery and a bakery in the same building, because we were like, well, if 2030 is worth fighting for, it's definitely going to have that in it. And I can still tell you, like, the names of the beers that we made and how our education program worked and everything. And the next year in my town, we then started a brewery from the momentum of having had that experience. And then a couple of years later, we did a big crowdfunder where we raised like 170 grand or something to fund this business. And people would say, "About how do you know this is going to work?" And I'd say, because I played it. I absolutely know it's going to work. And so there's something incredibly powerful about that, I think, when we do that in a way that we really allow ourselves to suspend disbelief, to suspend that little yes but voice that's always in the back of our imagination. Is why when I do workshops, we always do that yes and exercise from improv. and just getting people into that kind of way of thinking, because we just get so stuck and trip ourselves up all the time.
So I'm curious, a lot of the work that you seem to do, and again, correct me if I've misread this, a lot of it seems to be with citizens. And I'm curious, is there a reason that you've got the citizen focus? To what extent do you work with policymakers and decision makers and government and businesses and so on? What is the difference? Where is the value?
Well, I basically work wherever I get invited to go.
Okay.
And for the last 18 years, really, my work has been with the transition movement, which is the bottom-up community-led
Yes.
thing. So I've done a lot of work working with community groups across Europe. I don't fly, so that's the extent of my physical ability to get to places. But more recently, I've been doing work with municipalities, with companies. I've done stuff with Patagonia and the London Marathon Group and Balenciaga in Paris, and different municipalities. But it's really, I mean, I'd love to be. I think as this stuff grows, I find there's more and more interest coming from more and more different places, and that I go where the doors open, basically. So, but when I do work with companies or with municipalities, I always ask those people to show up as themselves, not as their role. Show up here as a parent, as a grandparent, as a son, a daughter. Turn up as yourself, not as your role. Leave your role outside, and let's do this as people who care about each other and who care about other people. So, yeah, I mean, there's lots of places I'd love to get this work into.
For example.
Well, I think the point is that there are so many companies that are trashing everything, and who, it's the thing that I learned from I said before, the imagination needs space. Companies need to create space within themselves to reimagine everything, or they're just going to carry on doing what they've always done. That's how these things work, right? So there are companies at the moment who are accelerating the collapse of everything, and who never pause to stop and think, hang on a minute, maybe we could do things in a different way. So I guess banks, insurance companies, people like that.
And of course, ultimately, everything comes down to people, right? In my work, wearing my sustainability and climate training hat, I give lots of talks and run workshops at organizations and businesses across Europe. And I always take the time to remind people that businesses and organizations are made up of people. You've already pointed out that when we're imagining hopeful, sustainable futures, people often come up with very similar visions, right? What did you speak about? You mentioned clean, fresh air, lots of car-free spaces, birdsong, meaningful work, that sort of thing, right? And that cuts across background and culture and age and so on. And so what I'm thinking is that seeding change through individual values and changing an organization as a result, this sounds quite delicious. And thinking about delicious things, when I introduced the podcast, I left the introduction on a bit of a cliffhanger. I mentioned that you have a book and an event format that you'll be launching later this year. And you've already touched on the book a little bit, but I wonder if you'd tell us more about it. And I definitely want to hear more about your sexy multi-sensory event experience, please.
Yeah. So the book is called How to Fall in Love with the Future: A Time Traveler's Guide to Changing the World, and it'll be out in May with Chelsea Green Publishing. And it's I always keep thinking with each book I write, I always keep thinking, is this going to be the book where people think, do you know what? I was with him up until now, but he's absolutely lost the plot. What is he on about now? So it's kind of a book about time travel as a tool for activists, really.
Okay.
And it's about what would movements for change look like if their primary objective wasn't giving people enough scary information so that they'll act, which has clearly failed.
Yeah.
And works for maybe 5-10% of the population, and really doesn't work for everybody else. What would it look like instead if the primary objective of activist organizations was to nurture longing for a different future? because the nurturing of longing requires a very different skill set, and it requires a skill set often not found in the activist world. You know, who are the people in our culture who are brilliant at cultivating longing? They're not climate scientists. They're rarely climate activists. They're storytellers, poets, street artists, people who write scripts for Netflix, people who work in advertising, who have really mastered the dark arts of that. You know, we need those people. We cannot do this without those people. So it's really a book about what change making would look like if it was rooted in the power of longing and temporal fluidity. So it shares the stories of many different activists and artists that I discovered across the world who are I discovered, that makes me sound like Christopher Columbus. Look at this land I discovered, whose work I came across around the world, who are doing extraordinary things, who I think probably most readers won't have come across a lot of those people. And I think when you put them all together, what I hope people can then kind of sense is maybe the beginning of a movement that is a positive futurism movement. Because I always felt like Extinction Rebellion really missed a trick, you know, and I know why they did it. And Extinction Rebellion is awesome; it's a fantastic thing. But I felt like in that first big rebellion in April 2019, when the media was saying, okay, so what should we do? Like, what would the world be like if we actually did this? And they would say, well, that's not for us to say. That needs to come from citizens' assemblies. And I know why they did that, but I felt that was such a missed opportunity.
Yeah, to paint a picture, right?
The picture that was like you had all the world's media going, so what should we do then? Like, okay, well, we're going to tell you, so we're going to take you on a journey, step into our time machine. Do you know what I mean? Could have been something really rich and powerful. So then the music project that you mentioned, recordings from the future, and that came about. So during the first lockdown, I was listening to a lot of ambient electronic music, which is a genre that I have just come to adore because I could work while I was listening to it. Anything with a beat or with lyrics, I can't concentrate. It pulls my mind off to something else. This kind of ambient electronic music is just this beautiful, sort of slightly on the edge of classical, sometimes very spacious, beautiful genre of music. And some artists who make that music, like a guy called Biosphere, who's a Norwegian guy, uses sound recordings just in the most beautiful of ways. And there was one particular track that I was listening to by an artist called Mr. Kit, which used field recordings in a way that just evoked community and connection, and it was just beautiful. And I thought, do you know, I'd love to wouldn't it be amazing if somebody made music where the field recordings came from the future? And I thought, well, maybe I could do that. And if I did it, I'd love to work with that Mr. Kit guy, but he's probably like impossibly cool and he lives in Berlin or LA and never answers emails. And I looked him up and he lived in my town.
Funny.
And so I got in touch with him and we met up for a cup of coffee and I said, look, I've got this idea. And he was like, brilliant. Okay, let's do it. Amazing. So then as I was going around doing my transition stuff, visiting different places, I always had my recorder with me. And sometimes I would just arrive somewhere and think, this sounds like the future. And I would go off and I would just make recordings and talk to people. I would say to people, describe your project to me as if it's 2030. And so we might be going to visit a project that hasn't even happened yet. We're standing in an empty field where someone is planning to build a solar restaurant. And I'd say, describe it to me. And they would just say, oh, you can see the gardens over here. And we build music up out of that, you know. And it's been an absolutely glorious, delightful, beautiful thing. And so in June, around the time the book comes out, there will be a double vinyl edition, which makes me so. As you can see, vinyl is something very precious to me, and it's the first time it's fulfilling my 15-year-old me's dream ever since of making a record and a digital download of that. But then, what we're creating alongside that is the field recordings from the future time portal, which is currently being developed, and we're going to be doing a dress rehearsal of at the end of March, which is going to be like an immersive space that we can create in places, which is like a big tent made out of this fabric that takes projections really beautifully. And then we'll have all these different projectors and a stage where we'll be playing the music live. and then all the visuals. And I've been back to all the places that I made the field recordings in and recorded video footage in each of those places. So it'll be like a sort of 360-degree surround immersive step into the future, where
Mm,
we'll see landscapes rewilded by beavers and regenerative farms and car-free neighborhoods and underground mushroom farms and the bicycle rush hour, and
mhm,
a future in which people who are forced to migrate receive a warm welcome wherever they
mm,
arrive. And we will be doing that a few times in 2025, different events. And my hope for that really is that and we're rather pretentiously calling it the Cirque du Soleil for the radical imagination, which is so pretentious.
Hope you don't get sued.
But it's kind of our it's kind of the ambition that we have of it. I'd love for it to become like, those sort of immersive Van Gogh experience things that just go off and tour around the world. And there's probably 3 or 4 of them touring around at any one given time. I'd love this to become that there are time portals just opening up in cities all around the world. They're there for 3 or 4 days. You don't want to miss it. You're actually going to be, for those 3 or 4 days, we're going to tear the fabric of time and invite you through to see the future that resulted from us doing everything we possibly could have done. You don't want to miss that.
Mm,
Maybe that's the way that we tackle this sort of pulling back of action on climate change, the rise of fascism, because it's always worth remembering that the way fascists work is by painting terrifying visions of the future and then saying, but we're strong and tough and we can protect you from that future. And the problem at the moment is if people who are progressive voices on climate and social justice are also just painting terrifying visions of the future, people have nowhere to turn and nowhere to go. So the idea is with that it gives people a sense of that's the thing. That's the thing. Because at the moment, the future is being colonized by
mm.
Trump and Musk and all these loathsome individuals. And we need to wrestle it back because we can't have that happen.
And for me, this just resonates so strongly. It really reinforces this idea that I have about co creating hopeful, sustainable futures. I often feel that when we talk about climate change and wicked problems, we forget about the hope. Why do we do that? At the risk of being a bit of a Pollyanna, I have to declare my belief that there is always hope. I think it was Viktor Frankl who said something like, whoever was still alive had reason for hope. And, obviously he was talking about a very particular context. And yet I think that there is a real comparison with where we are now. There are an awful lot of us who are happily very much alive. And therefore I feel that there is reason for hope. Okay, so I'd like to ask a question that's all about the practicalities for a moment. If there's someone out there listening and thinking, ooh, I really love what Rob's talking about, but I have no idea how to get started, how could they get started? How do you deal with stuff like funding and finding locations and marketing before you get to the fun part of running an event or giving a talk and giving people a chance to light up the room with their explorations into the future?
I mean, I don't really promote what I do. I mean, I think I do a little bit, I guess, but I think at the moment the way it tends to work is I do something for one organization and then they really like it, and then the people who come to that go off and tell all their, oh, I saw this great thing, it was really cool, we should do that. And
Mm,
so it kind of spreads by word of mouth.
okay.
The thing that so I'm one of those people who is very I might get run over by a bus tomorrow,
Slosh.
I hopefully not, but um I'm not one of those. I'm not one of those people who's like a massive intellectual property person. This is all
Mm,
my. I come up with stuff and then I'm like, take it, run with, do it. Play around with it. And it's been the same since the beginning of the transition movement. That was really like, here's some tools, maybe they're useful. So How to Fall in Love with the Future contains all the tools and activities that I do, very much with a sort of, okay, well, we want you to be able to build your own time machine. Here's how you build your own time machine. Here's the tricks and tools and things that we use. What I what I what I'm going to be doing over the next couple of months, because it's something I've been really bad at for ages, is 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 to start building a bit of a sort of community of practice around it. So I
mm,
want to start doing a monthly newsletter because I'm noticing as the as the various social media tools, which initially we thought were the tools that would enable us to dismantle the master's house, to use Audre Lorde's phrase, become the master's tools, it's harder and harder to, the algorithms that drive these things make this kind of stuff less, harder and harder to keep visible, I think. So I want to build a kind of start doing a monthly newsletter of sharing the things that I'm doing and things that I'm writing and stuff like that, to start building more of a, so if that'll be, I want to do something called the Time Traveler's Gazette, which will be like a monthly newsletter thing that I'll start doing maybe when the book comes out.
Ooh, fantastic. Well, we'll have to keep an eye out for that then. For what it's worth, I have more projects than I can keep track of sometimes, and for every project that I have, I build a website, and on every website I include a sign up for my newsletter block. Not that I have any time to write newsletters, Rob, but the sign up to my newsletter block is there. What I've seen, even though there are no newsletters that go out, is that there's been a significant increase in sign-ups in the last 8 to 12 months across all of my projects. I'll probably have to start writing a newsletter soon. I'm just throwing that out there for you to say, yes, I think the Gazette sounds like a great plan. This is a very timely time for a newsletter of some sort.
There's an amazing book. I'm just starting to write an article about, there's a book that I loved, I read when I was 18, that was written in 1972 by Angela Carter, who was an extraordinary British sort of surrealist, psychedelic novelist. She wrote Nights at the Circus and things were probably her better known books. She wrote a book called The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman, which is this wild book about this South American city where this evil genius called Dr. Hoffman has developed this sort of ray gun that he fires at the city, and it brings alive everybody's dreams and desires. And so we could be walking down the street and then all the lampposts turn into daffodils and then ghosts are running around. And it's like the whole city is on acid and nobody quite knows what's going on. And the hero of the story's job is to go off and find Dr. Hoffman and turn his machine off, you know. And I feel like, firstly, it's a really interesting way of looking at what's happening at the moment, you know, that Trump and Musk and this whole thing. Steve Bannon used to say, you know, we have to just flood the zone with shit. And like everyone's just reeling from this sort of what they're doing, and it's like stealing away from us our agency over. It's colonizing the future. It's taking the future away from people. But it's also the thing that I want to write about in this article is we have to get much better at building desire machines ourselves. We have to build more powerful, more effective, more attractive desire machines, which we can then be, you know, that one, if we can do this thing where we can bring in actors and people who do amazing stuff with projecting light onto buildings and creating what I call in the book pop-up tomorrows, you know, where you take a space and you transform it into how it could be, and that we involve actors in that, and we create these sort of that we bring the future into the present in ways that are creative and playful, and which fascists would never dream of doing because they have no imagination. That's why they're fascists in the first place. You know, there's something about that story that really stayed with me since I read it, which was, either we just say, oh, our imagination is being colonized, what Henry Giroux calls the Trump disimagination machine, you know, or we get much better at building our own desire machines.
So we need these desire machines to kind of counteract all of this rubbish that's coming at us. And also to kind of break people's apathy, right? Because I feel around climate change, there's a lot of apathy. There's kind of, I can't do anything. I don't have agency. It doesn't really matter. One drop in the ocean, etc., etc. And I feel that this wave from the other side of the pond, really, you know, I think we're all like, oh my God, what do we do? We're just frozen. We can't do anything. So this desire machine is a wonderful vision right in my head. I've already got some ideas about how that might look for me. So.
I mean, that's the point. That's an intentional response they have cultivated in us. Right? So, because I remember the first time he was elected, people's responses were, right, what are we going to do? You know, you had the Women's March, you had these big things. Now everyone's saying, yeah, but what can I do?
Well, and not even that. You spoke earlier on about fascism and fear, and I can imagine that a lot of people are thinking that if they do stick their head above the parapet, they're going to be thinking, am I going to lose my livelihood? Or will I or my family and my friends be targeted personally? And that's why I feel that your idea of the desire machine is a soft way, a low barrier entry point, if you will, to start imagining creative ways in which people can possibly contribute that won't make them feel vulnerable and at risk. Because frankly, not many people are willing or able to take the sorts of risks that might be involved in being too visible in a time of, what can I call it, rising fascism. Okay, so moving swiftly on, let me recap briefly. We have your wonderful book that's coming out that's going to be a great read and a toolbox for intrepid people everywhere who want to harness the power of the imagination to reclaim hopeful futures. And of course, even before the book comes out, we can tap into your experience and wisdom on your website and your blog and so on. But what about right now? Do you perhaps have one tip or suggestion for people who are so inspired by your words and ideas that they want to start doing something right now?
Yeah, I think one thing is that we talked before about how remembering the past and imagining the future are very, very similar processes.
Mm-hmm.
And so our our ability to imagine the future in hopeful and positive, bright, shiny ways is only possible if our memory includes stories that allow us to think that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
So it's much, much harder to imagine a radically lower carbon future that's delicious and wonderful and which everyone is flourishing if we just watch Fox News all day,
Mm-hmm.
or watch GB News, because you've got nothing to work with at all. There's no stories there. All your stories are like yes but stories, and it's never going to work, and it's too expensive, and what's the point? And so for me, what I would say to people is start filling the cupboards of your memory with those stories. There's a whole chapter in the new book which is just like, okay, you might not, I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of stories of places I've been where there's some amazing stuff going on, and you probably haven't heard these stories because they don't get into the paper. So I'm going to take you to Liège, where that city is building a whole new food system around itself. I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to take you to the car-free neighborhoods of Germany, the bicycle rush hour of Utrecht, where 40,000 people cycle into Utrecht every morning because they built the infrastructure. And guess what? When you build really good cycling infrastructure, people start using it and people ride bicycles. I'm going to take you to landscapes rewilded by beavers where the biodiversity has just exploded. It's like you can find those stories if you know where to
Mm-hmm.
look. The 2030 that we've been talking about here, that I talked a bit more about earlier on, it didn't just sort of fall fully formed magically out of the sky on New Year's Eve 2029. If you knew where to look in 2025, you could already find it. And
Mm-hmm.
go and find it and find those stories. You can follow Transition Together is the transition movement for England and Wales. Their social media shares all kinds of amazing stories of what communities are doing. We Are Possible share really good stuff. Subscribe to Positive News Magazine. There are a number of different accounts on social media
Mm-hmm.
that share those stories, because when I do my time machine exercise with people, and then when we step back into 2025 and I ask them to share what they saw and what they witnessed, I always say at the end, this should be a daily practice, like meditation, like yoga, like running, because the reality is that doing the opposite of this activity is a daily practice. Every
Mm-hmm.
day, we wake up, we roll over, we turn on our phones, we go onto our Instagram feed or whatever it is, or we open the newspaper, and we just Trump this, Trump that, Musk that, Gaza this, everything's broken, everyone's horrible. You might as well just roll over and go back to bed because you can't do anything. Imagine how different that would be if you turned over and actually your news feed said, do you know what? In Grimsby, they've just organised and bought a whole street of houses. People are getting together and doing that. In Frome, Mayday Saxonvale have just secured the site to do an incredible, really ambitious community-led development on that site. Did you know that this amount of renewables, blah, 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 that actually the net zero economy already in this country is generating far more money than not doing it, and people who work in that economy are paid better and happier than people working. It's like recalibrate what you allow inside your mind, the
Mm-hmm.
stories that you allow in there, because the fact that at the moment you're feeling like it's hopeless and we can't do anything and you're feeling completely disorientated is an utterly intended thing that has cost some very rich people a lot of money to create that feeling and that set of emotions inside you right now. And so
Mm.
one of the main things we need to be doing is reclaiming that. And I think one of the ways by doing that is by changing the stories that we allow to flood into our subconscious.
Whew, yeah. You know, you were talking a bit about missed opportunities in the context of Extinction Rebellion and storytelling earlier on. And I feel that in the climate, sustainability, environmental, and similar spaces, that we've also really failed when it comes to storytelling and framing the narrative. You know, so many of the stories, as you say, are negative. It's doomism, it's the end of the world, it's how many more creatures have been wiped out or pushed towards extinction this year than the success stories, the admittedly less dramatic but no less valuable stories of positivity and hope. And honestly, if it's the end of the world, and if experts are telling us that there's nothing we can do to prevent this terrible vision of the future, why should people bother? So I think you're right. I think so many people don't know about these stories. And in many respects, these are snippets of what we'd call in the Futures and Foresight world desirable futures. And there are so many of these success stories and stories of turning the tide. Ultimately, these signals of the future are everywhere we look. They're evidence of possible futures that are already here. And really, really exciting, actually. Very exciting. So knowing that you've devoted a whole chapter to this in your book is heartening and really inspiring too. Right, I'm just keeping an eye on time, and I'm mindful that we're coming up to an hour, and you're a busy chap. So as we slowly wind things up, I'm just wondering, is there anything that we haven't covered that you really wanted to cover? Anything that you'd like to say that you just want to leave people with before we bring things to a close? The floor is entirely yours, my lovely Rob.
Well, I guess just a little thing. I mentioned about Anaïg Plassard in France with her riding her horse. One of the things that's been really interesting to me is, and this is like before the book even comes out, this is just off the back of talks and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
it's that I get people sending me pictures of time machines they've built.
Okay.
It's really, really fascinating and so beautifully eccentric and bonkers. And so a couple of weeks ago, no, hang on, I'll scroll back. So a few months ago, I was on a podcast with a woman called Gillian Judson, who does loads of work in Canada around imagination and education.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on with a guy called Michael something, who was a head teacher of a school on an island in British Columbia. And on that podcast, we talked about time travel and time machines and stuff like that. And he just sent me, just as I was finishing writing this book, just in time for me to be able to get it into the book, he sent me this story about how in his school, he completely redesigned the last year of the curriculum for students in his school. So it was all about time travel. And the students built a time machine, and everything they did was through the lens of having built a time machine and time travel. They did 2050. And at the end of the term, they did a thing where they transformed their school into a time machine. People walked in through this tunnel with all these lights and took people through time. And then they'd made all these leaflets that were like promotional leaflets by the organizations who had been pivotal in making that change. They now had a ministry of beauty on the island, for example. They did a banquet of food from the future. They had a project that was all about how AI now had enabled them to be able to talk to the whales
Mm.
and the other creatures around in the sea around their island, and how that had
Mm.
transformed the policies they made. It was just beautiful, like thing of, okay, well, how would that be if in every school around the world, the last year of the education system was you built a time machine together, and then you figured out what that was all going to be like. And then also my friend Jakob, who lives in Denmark, who I've been to Copenhagen a couple of times and done these workshops, and it's so sweet. He has kids his kids are like 3 and 5 or something.
Mm.
And he would go home and they'd say, "What did you do today, Dad?" "Oh, I built time machines with Rob Hopkins." "Oh, wow. And where did you go?" And so his kids started in this new school, this primary school. And he said that when he went to pick his kids up from school, the teacher said, "Oh, are you the dad who builds time machines?"
Brilliant.
And then so the kids built in the classroom now, the kids built a time machine, which is this thing on the wall that you have to put your hand on, and then you can set the dials and press the buttons. So now when the teachers want to teach them about anything in history, they go back in the time machine to go and visit the dinosaurs and stuff. And I just love this idea that maybe one of the outputs of this book is going to be just this explosion of people building time machines in all kinds of different settings all around the world. That would be really nice, I think. Because God, and actually, I'll leave you with one little thought, which was that I gave a talk in a town in France a couple of years ago, a place called Pontivy. And at the end of the talk, the first guy to ask a question was a guy who worked for the municipality. And he said, really enjoyed that, really great. And do you know, the last time I was in this room was a year ago for a talk by a woman who was the last surviving member of the French resistance. She was 95. She was in the French resistance as a teenager. And she gave a talk about what that was like. And somebody asked her a question at the end, which was, all the people you knew in the French resistance, was there anything they all had in common? And she thought about it, and then she said, yeah, they were all optimists. And I feel like there are some times in history when you really, really need optimists. And this is one of those times. We're in one of those times now. And I feel like, yes, what we're building is time machines, but kind of maybe what we're really building is optimist generating machines. And I think this is a time when we need optimists, maybe more than we have at any point in the last 60, 70 years.
This is a time when we need optimists more than we have at any time in the last 60 years. What a fantastic way to end a podcast, a call to action. We need more optimists to help us shape the futures we want. Rob, I am so grateful for your time and your knowledge and your optimism, of course. If you're listening and you want more access to the lovely Rob, you'll find loads of links and resources in the show notes. And if you want to bring Rob and his portable time travel machine and his Imaginarium and his multi-sensory event, what did you call it, Rob? The Cirque du Soleil?
For the radical imagination.
Yes, for the radical imagination. Then it's time to start reaching out and figuring out interesting ways to bring Rob to you. With that being said, Rob, thank you so much. It has been a delight.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of Futuring Is. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you feel inspired to travel to the future and pre-experience a possible hopeful future in 2035. If you want to hear from more thinkers, dreamers and doers who are reshaping our world for the better by using the future as a lens, you can subscribe to the podcast in your favourite podcasting tool or subscribe to the Futuring Is newsletter at www.futuringis.com, and I'll send you a personal note every time a new episode appears. Last but not least, if you're a thinker, dreamer or doer who is reshaping our world for the better, using the future as a lens, or if you know someone who fits that description, please do get in touch. Perhaps you'd be the perfect guest for the next podcast. And that's it for today. Until we meet again, I hope you go well, stay well, and find time to plant seeds that will grow into hopeful, sustainable futures.